So we will be recording today's session. We'd like to welcome Bronwyn Aly from the University of Illinois Local Food System Small Farms Extension Advisor or Educator. Um, Bronwyn is here today to share with us some information about growing strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, and blueberries in your backyard. Bronwyn has over 20 years of experience in small fruit production and is more than happy to help anyone interested in learning about proper planting, pruning, fertility, and pest control techniques to make growing small fruit very rewarding. Thank you, Bronwyn, for joining us today. We appreciate you giving us your time this afternoon, and we know it's a little bit of a rainy afternoon, but a great time to learn about all the fruits and everything that's coming into season. So we appreciate you joining us today for our spring fling.
All right. Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks for asking me to be a part of the weekly programming that you guys have put together for the spring. And so, like she said, today I'm going to be talking to you about growing small fruits in your backyard and how that can be very rewarding. Again, like she said, my name is Bronwyn Aly, Local Food Systems and Small Farms Educator, and I'm actually located in far southeast Illinois, so in the 6 counties further south than where Chris and your unit is located. So I cover Pope, Hardin, Saline, Gallatin, Hamilton, and White counties. And actually, my office is located at the Dixon Springs Ag Center, which is the southernmost outdoor applied ag research center with the University of Illinois. And so we conduct research in high tunnels on fruit and vegetable crops, as well as provide programming, extension-related programming to folks about fruit and vegetable production. So we will get started. So again, we're talking about small fruit in the backyard. And there we go. So what are some of the benefits of growing small fruits? If you're able to grow small fruits in your own backyard, the quality of that fruit is going to be really great because you're able to harvest it and, whether you immediately consume it or preserve it, cook with it, however you're going to use it. And so we're going to see excellent taste, flavor in that as compared to, some of the strawberries, not to be dissing our California and Florida grown berries that we see coming into the grocery stores this time of year. But when you look in those clamshells and half of the berry is still white and hasn't completely ripened, I'm always a little leery that the taste isn't going to be right quite like that, as opposed to the ones in this container that I've, that were picked fresh from, my backyard. And so growing your own at home, we see a higher quality fruit, so that impacts the flavor, the taste, obviously availability. It's a lot more efficient to go out in the backyard and pick something that you need to cook with or eat, as opposed to running to town to the grocery store. You can grow things pretty simply. Doesn't take you don't have to put out an acre of any particular crop. You can grow things to meet the scale of your particular needs. A lot of times it's pretty cost efficient, and the main thing, at least for me, is it's fun to do. And so if we think about planting our small fruit garden, you want to limit the size of the planting to what's going to meet the needs of your family. If it's, if you've got, 4 or 5 people living in the house, you might want to, and everybody loves fruit, and everybody loves strawberries, you may want to put a larger area out. Then let's just say it's, it's just yourself, and you don't need to maybe plant as big of an area. And so think about the size of the planting that's going to meet the needs of your family. Our site should definitely be a fertile, well-drained area located near your house. Whether you're growing small fruit or any type of gardening, it's kind of found that the closer it is to your house, the more attention you pay to it. If you have to walk way out past the backyard into the starting, on a good walk away from the house, you're probably not going to manage it as well as if you can locate it nearer to the house. And one of the interesting things with small fruit is that they're pretty easy to incorporate into your landscaping. So, as you're thinking about putting some different perennial shrubs in, maybe you think about substituting blueberry bushes in for what you were considering to look at as a perennial shrub in your landscape. You can also choose cultivars that are adapted to your region. You're also able to choose cultivars that you prefer the flavor of. A lot of these different small fruits, there's many different cultivars or varieties that grow well here in Southern Illinois. And so we can pick the ones that taste the best to us. Anytime you're ordering or acquiring any type of planting material, you want to make sure that it is certified virus-free. We always, start good, stay good is one of the mottos I like to have. And so if we know that we're starting with clean plant material that's certified virus-free, then, we've got a little bit of a jump on keeping some of those virus diseases at bay. We think about site preparation for any of our small fruit crops. We're going to want to avoid, really wet or poorly drained soils. Now, a lot of our soils here in Southern Illinois have a pretty heavy clay component. And so, sometimes we might need to throw up a ridge or a hill to help with the drainage in a particular area. If you see in this picture, these bramble planting, they've put that up on elevated raised beds. And you can see from the drainage in this field, there's water standing between the rows, but because they're up on a raised bed, their roots are staying a little bit drier and they're able to drain a little bit better. So as you're looking at your site, think about the drainage and looking at well-drained areas. You're going to want to prepare your site well in advance. Just like with the vegetable crops or anything else, we definitely want to recommend you taking a soil sample, getting a soil test, and see where your organic matter and your pH is at. Also, what nutrients are already available and at what levels in your current location, and what you might need to do to amend that. Some of our amendments can take 6 months to a year to actually start making changes that we're amending for. And so we want to plan these out, because if we think about blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, those are a perennial crop, even strawberries as well. But you're going to get several years where those are in the ground, and so we want to make sure that the site is prepared to the best of our ability before we put those make those plantings. If you're going to go into an area that's not been worked or is a sod area, you want to try to turn that sod under a year before planting, give it time to break down and work into the soil there. Most of these crops prefer a little bit slightly acidic soil. Blueberries especially, their optimum pH range is between 4.8 and 5.2. And so we want to, again, this is where the soil test comes in to see where you're starting at and what you might need to amend to. And we're going to work or prepare the soil as thoroughly as we would for a vegetable garden. Another thing to think about as we're putting out small fruit crops is pest control. When I think about pests, I think about diseases, insects, weeds, and even our mammal pests, the two-legged and the four-legged kinds. So what are we going to do to think about pest control management? And there are several common diseases on both the fruit and the leaves, and those can occur if we're not doing some management, cultural practice type things to help control those. Airflow, having the right spacing between your plants really helps with some of our disease issues. Having mulch down at the base can also help with some of that. And there's several cultural control things or practices that we can put into play to help kind of mitigate a few of the diseases that can come into play on our small fruit crops. And then also, as we're selecting our varieties or our cultivars, some varieties have some resistance to some of the diseases that are out there. And if we could select those varieties that are less susceptible to diseases, that is also a benefit to us. So we think about insect and even weeds, being able to go out and scout your planting and look for those insect pests. And if you're constantly looking for them, then we can maybe catch them and try to manage them before they get too far out of control. And, weeds are always going to be a challenge, but if we can stay ahead of them, there's going to be a lot of, mechanical control, hand pulling, hoeing on those. There's not a lot of herbicides that are available to homeowners that we can use in our backyard. And this is, again, where mulching comes into play. If we can use straw mulch or other types of mulching materials, maybe even weed mat that you can put around your planting to help control some of the weeds, that's definitely going to be beneficial. And I'm just going to touch briefly on a few of the insects that we see that are going to be pretty common in all of the different small fruit crops that we're talking about today. The Japanese beetle, I think everybody's heard of the Japanese beetle. It's been around for several years now, migrated into our area. And I think I feel like the population of Japanese beetles has kind of fallen back off after that initial surge into our area. But they're still definitely a problem pest, feeding on the leaves, and they can defoliate our plants. They have, like 250 different host plants. And so they can definitely be an issue that we need to watch out for and try to control those. And then also thrips. Thrips, actually, we find those in the flowers or the blossoms, and we won't necessarily see damage from them until after the fruit has fully formed and is starting to ripen, and then we'll see some damage on the fruit. They're not going to cause a lot of rot. They're actually a pretty minor pest as far as how they affect the overall quality of your fruit. But they are a pest that is in all of our small fruit crops. And the bigger problem that we see, and that we've talked about this insect for the last few years now, is the spotted winged Drosophila. It's a type of fruit fly, and it lays its eggs in our ripening fruit, and it prefers very soft-skinned fruits. So raspberries, blackberries, blueberries. We do see them in strawberries in the later season, towards the end of the strawberry season. The populations of spotted winged Drosophila tend to jump up on us in mid to late June. We can see them a little bit earlier, but that's when we start to see the numbers really increase, and they just continue to increase through the rest of the growing season each year. And for a homeowner, some things that we can do to help to mitigate some of the problems that they cause once the fruit flies lay their egg inside the fruit. After it hatches, then that larva is eating the ripe fruit inside and can cause it to just go mushy. And so we would like to harvest as quickly as possible. As soon as our fruits start to get ripe, we want to go out and harvest. So if that means we need to check our planting every day as opposed to every third day or fourth day, we want to make sure we're getting harvesting a lot more often and getting the ripe fruit out of our planting. If you have any fruits that have already dropped or overripes or fallen off, we want to clean those up from underneath the planting, because that is just areas that attract those fruit flies to lay more eggs in. After we do harvest them, we want to bring those in and the fruit in and refrigerate it pretty quickly. A lot of times we used to be able to pick our fruit and we could set it up on the counter, leave it out on the counter for the day or overnight until we were ready to either cook with it, or maybe we're making jelly or jam. But with as we've started to see the spotted winged Drosophila, if we leave our fruit out at room temperature, if we have any egg laying that has occurred, that will go ahead and ripen and start to break down that fruit. But if we can get it in the refrigerator or even freeze it, it can stop that process and definitely slow it down. And so the quality of our fruit is going to be better. And you can see the links on here if you would like more information on spotted winged Drosophila and some of the control measures. the Michigan State University website. There on the bottom, they have a lot of great information on control of spiderwing Drosophila. And so let's talk a little bit about small fruit plantings overall and how they can be a decorative part of your landscaping. You know, this picture on the top left is matted row strawberries. You know, and if you were thinking about a way to maybe transition your landscaping into a more edible things that could help with, you know, as you want to add more local fruits and vegetables into your diet, and you can incorporate it into your existing landscaping. You know, if you have an area where you're looking at maybe an ivy ground cover, could you replace it with strawberries in a matted row system? You can see, you know, the picture here on the left, how that's really filling in. And the picture on the right is a blueberry planting, and they have really great fall color. You know, that's a really bright red fall color. And so that can be something that could be very interesting to add into your landscaping. And also a lot of the small fruit crops now have varieties that are being bred for container production. The blueberry there on the top left is, I believe the variety is called Top Hat. And it is actually bred to be grown in a large container on a deck or, you know, backyard somewhere, a containerized variety. And so it's going to stay very small in stature compared to, you know, one that we would grow out typically that was for you know, regular field production. And then also with the strawberries, strawberries are really easy to grow in hanging baskets, or you can see this tiered planter system here on the picture on the right. So there's a lot of ways that we can incorporate small fruit into our backdoor plantings. And also think about ways to be innovative with those plantings. You know, we look at the picture on the top left. We got some either blackberry or raspberries going into the ground, and they've kind of made a raised bed where they've amended the soil, and they have weed mat down. So they're within that planting row, they're going to be able to control the weeds. They'll be able to mow the grass around that. They've kind of trimmed out a bed there, and so you'll be able to mow and weed eat up next to it and still not get into the planting itself. And they've created a way to trellis or train those canes and keep them up off the ground. And the picture in the middle, they actually took an old gutter and attached it to the side of a brick wall running down the side of their yard and put soil in it, and are able to plant strawberries into that. You know, so any type of container or way that you can use to modify what you've already got existing to grow some of these crops would be really easy. And the last picture on the right, I think is a really good alternative to creating a trellis system for growing up your raspberries or blackberries. You know, they're using treated 4x4s and treated 2x4s, and then attaching hog panel onto those. And you can see the bottom is a little bit narrower than the top, so we'd still be able to create a V shape. And as our canes grow, we can guide them through the squares in that hog panel wire, and still be able to create the V trellis that we a lot of times recommend on in our pruning and training of raspberry and blackberries to help with airflow and sunlight into the crown of the plant. And so I think that this picture on the right is definitely a lot sturdier structure and would hold up well for a small blackberry or raspberry planting. So now we'll kind of get into some specifics of the crops as we think about talking about strawberries. And so as far as planting strawberries, we're going to want to plant those in the early spring, you know, as soon as the ground can be worked. And, you know, depending on how you're going to, the area that you're planting them into and how you want to grow them, we can put them into what we call a matted row system. We could also do a spaced row system and even a hill system. And with a matted row system, that's typically the system most of us are familiar with. This is where we're planting a single row, anywhere from 18 to 30 inches. Plants are spaced apart anywhere from 18 to 30 inches, usually around 2 feet or 24 inches. And they'll be spaced in a single row. And if we have multiple rows, we'll put those 3 to 4 feet apart. And this is typically how we see our Junebearing and even our Everbearing varieties can be planted out in the matted row system. And as those plants grow and spread, we want their daughter plants to peg into the ground and fill in that space. And so, maybe they'll end up filling in 2 feet wide on those rows. And then we're gonna, we'll have that a solid mat of strawberry plants that will produce fruit. A little bit modified version of that, could probably look at this if you were planting into a raised bed situation where you're limiting the number of daughter plants that you allow to peg into the ground. This allows you to have more control over the space that those plants grow into. And then a hill system, this is where we would completely remove the daughter plants. The hill system, we also use that in that same removal of daughter plants when we, on a commercial scale, when we plant strawberries in the fall on raised beds and black plastic mulch for annual strawberry production. We don't want daughter plants to grow in that system. We just want the main mother plant to produce the fruit the next spring. If you're planting into containers, you probably are not going to want the daughter plants to spread. So you would be pinching those runners off and just letting the main mother plant continue to grow and make branch crowns in your container. The most important thing to remember when we're doing strawberry planting is the depth of the planting. As we order strawberry plants, or maybe you go to the local garden center and pick up a bundle of strawberry plants, those are typically coming as bare root plantings. And so they may or may not have broken dormancy. They may or may not have any new green leaves coming out the top, but planting them at the correct depth is going to be very important. The diagram on the bottom left shows you if we don't want to plant them too shallow or too deeply, about the middle of the crown, so that all of the roots will be planted, will be underneath the soil line, but not so deep that we're burying the very top of the crown. That's going to be pretty important. If they're not at the right depth, they're just not going to, those plants are going to struggle and not really grow very well. Just a little bit about Junebearing strawberries, blossoms themselves. That very first season that we plant, we're going to, as much as we hate to, we're going to want to remove the blossoms that first year. It just makes for a stronger plant that's going to overwinter better for you. They do benefit in increased size from pollination. And so we want to make sure that we're promoting as much bee activity and pollinator activity as we can around these plantings. And so if you are using any type of insecticide that's available to homeowners, make sure you're reading the label carefully and avoiding spraying at times that may impact any bees that are working your flowers. And do remember that certain diseases like botrytis gray mold, we might not see the effect of that disease until our strawberries are starting to ripen. And that's when they get that nasty gray on them. That disease actually starts at blossom time. And so there are a few products that we can get from our local garden center, that some fungicides that have a little bit of activity. I believe Captan is one of them that's available to homeowners that can help suppress some of the gray mold. But again, having good mulching underneath our plants, so we don't have any, we reduce the amount of soil that splashes up from rain events on our blooms. That's beneficial. And also, making sure that the planting is not so that we've renovated at some point and that we have pretty good airflow in that planting. And do know that strawberry blossoms are definitely sensitive to freezing temperatures. If you've got flowers on and we're going to have they're calling for a freeze. If it hits 32 degrees, we need to be able to cover those up somehow. If you've got a small area that maybe a sheet or a really light blanket would cover your planting. If it's going to be below freezing, we want to get those covered up. And if you've got larger plantings, they do make a product that we call a floating row cover that does offer some frost protection as well. And so you might think about those options. Some of our Junebearing varieties, in particular, I can think of Early Glow, that is an earlier variety, may end up being blooming in a time when the potential for a late frost or freeze is pretty highly likely. So we would need to be able to cover those if possible. And as we think about, in a matted row strawberry planting, we do need to mulch for wintertime. And this is where we're covering the dormant plants. And usually this is around, for us, mid to late November. You think about around Thanksgiving time or so. And this can, after we've had a few light frosts, the leaves will start to, kind of flatten down, and you can tell the plant is going dormant. The cold temperatures of winter are not, it's going to have to be, below 20 degrees to start to do any damage. But the bigger problem that we have with strawberries is what we call frost heaving. So as our ground freezes and then thaws, it can actually push the crown of that plant up out of its optimal growing zone, kind of push it up out to the top of the soil. And so having some mulch down actually helps to keep the soil temperatures at a more moderate, more consistent temperature. And so we don't see that freeze and thaw and that heaving activity that happens. And so, we're looking at, some type of straw, whether it's wheat straw or rye straw, and, anywhere 2 to 4 inches deep will be adequate. And we'll just cover that up in the winter. And then when we start to see the new growth initiating in the springtime, then we're going to want to pull that straw away from those plants, and you can just leave it in the aisles. And then, it's going to help provide some weed control in the aisleways. So not only does it benefit you in helping to keep your strawberries in place in the winter and protect them from really severe cold temperatures, but also help with some weed management. And as we get into year 2 and beyond, we're going to need to think about renovation of our Junebearing strawberries. So if we go into year 2, we let those blossoms, we leave blossoms on in year 2 and go through harvest. They set fruit, we harvest. And after the final harvest, we want to mow off or shear off all of the foliage on that whole planting and leave it about an inch or so above the crown. And at this point, we apply a little bit of fertilizer. We're looking at, a pound or pound and a half of a complete fertilizer, whether it's triple 12, triple 10, even a triple 15. So about a pound and a half per 100 square feet. And then we can take our a rototiller and go in and narrow the width of the row. At this point, in a matted row production, those daughter plants have pegged and spread out. And so that initial single row of plants that we planted has now, expanded to 2 or 3 feet wide. And we want to narrow that back to about a 6 to 12 inch wide row. And when we're doing that, we also want to make sure that we're eliminating any weeds. We go through with our hoe or hand weeding. And you can see the picture on the top is what planting kind of look like after we've mowed the strawberries off. And then we'll start to see a little bit of regrowth after that mowing. So from year 2 on, we're going to want to do renovation each year after harvest. So now we'll transition over into talking about raspberries and blackberries. So let's talk a little bit about the basic plant structure of brambles. We put raspberries and blackberries lumped into the category of brambles. And so both of these crops have a crown and roots that are perennial. So they're going to be coming, rejuvenating, regrowing it each year. So they live year after year, and they're going to, a new set of canes is produced every year. And some cultivars, some varieties, the canes come from the crown, and then some come up as root suckers. The canes that they throw up are only going to live for 2 years. So in the first year that the cane comes up, we call that cane a primocane, year one, primo for one. And that that's going to grow vegetatively and typically do not produce fruit. Those primocanes stay in place and they go through the winter. And as we start into the second season of them, we now change the name of that primocane and we now call it a floricane, because in this second season, it's going to transition from vegetative growth to reproductive growth, and it's going to set flowers. So in the second season, the floricane will produce fruit and then it's going to die. The floricanes after harvest can be removed, and while those floricanes in year 2 are setting their flowers and their fruit, the plant is also setting up or sending out new canes. So primocanes are coming up. After harvest is completed on the floricanes, we remove those, and we're still left with several canes that have come up that are the primocanes, and we'll overwinter those, and they will produce fruit as floricanes the next year. But there's always an exception. And so if we look at fall, or what we call everbearing raspberries, and there are also types of primocane bearing blackberries. And for fall raspberries or primocane blackberries, they can actually bear fruit on the primocane or first year canes starting in mid to late summer and into fall. And if those primocanes have borne fruit in the fall, and we leave them through the winter, they will actually fruit again a little bit lower on the cane in the late spring, early summer, and then die back. And so these crops are pretty unique because we can actually get 2 crops off of 1 cane. You guys, is the sound I'm hearing a little feedback.
It just started like that, so with the feedback.
You need to mute everybody. That goes away.
I just muted someone that joined us, so maybe that'll help.
Okay. Yeah, I don't hear it now, so maybe
yeah, I think we're good now. Yeah, someone just joined us, so I think maybe that was it.
Okay, all right. Okay, so we were talking about the primocane bearing fall raspberries and primocane bearing blackberries. And so it's pretty interesting on these particular varieties that we can actually get 2 crops off of the same cane. So if we think about our harvest windows for blackberries and raspberries, let's start with in early June. We can start to see our summer bearing raspberries will be bearing fruit, and we can start harvesting those. If we have a second crop that we have coming off of everbearing raspberries and the primocane bearing blackberries, we can see that in early June. And then also regular blackberries, they start in early June, and they're going, if we have the correct varieties selected, we can actually be harvesting varieties or blackberries from various varieties from early June all the way through frost. And then as we hit late July for us here in Southern Illinois, the first crop off of everbearing raspberries should start coming in. So if we think about on these blackberries and raspberries, are they as an individual plant or a hedgerow? The red and yellow raspberries can spread by root suckers, and so they're kind of going to naturally form a hedgerow. Whereas black and purple raspberries and blackberries don't spread from root suckers very often. And so those are going to tend to stay more in an individualized plant as opposed to really spreading out. So you just kind of be aware of that as you're thinking about how you're going to set up a planting and kind of what to expect from those. And then think about, do I need to trellis them or not? It's recommended for the semi-erect and trailing blackberry varieties to definitely trellis them. And it's not necessarily needed for raspberries, but it's been my experience with no matter what type of blackberry or raspberry that you grow, whether it's a trailing blackberry or a black raspberry or an erect blackberry, I think that a trellising is beneficial no matter what. If you have windy conditions, it's going to help provide some support to those canes and hopefully reduce any type of breakage on those canes. And it also helps you to provide a little bit of basic containment. Even for the varieties that are the semi-erect or erect, those can get grow out of control on you before you know it. And so if we have some defined areas with trellising, that helps us to kind of maintain and contain those plantings. And one of the newer trellising systems that we see on commercial farms is actually pretty neat. I want to put a picture in here, is a rotating trellis where we actually end up creating a wall of fruit. And so with this rotating trellis, we train primicanes on one side, and we're able to pull the pins on this and actually rotate and lay this whole row of canes. We can lay it flat through the winter, and then we'll lift it back up in the springtime, and all of these flowers actually form. They would have formed on the top of that, and then we can, as we lean this trellis, you see it now, the fruit is starting to ripen, and we rotate it even further, and so it's actually, a lot of the fruit is in the shade, and so the fruit quality is better. It's very efficient to harvest at this point because we're only harvesting off of the canes that are attached to this trellis arm. And while this is happening, we have primicanes growing up that are being tied to the other arm on the other side of the row that you don't see from this picture. And so this is there's a lot higher input cost. This is a lot more expensive way to trellis, but from a harvesting and fruit production side of things, it's a lot more efficient than some of the more traditional trellising methods. So if we think about, we're going to talk about pruning on these summer-bearing red raspberries. So they're not going to be pruned the year of planting. We're just going to let them grow that first year. But in the early spring on the second year and every year after that, we're going to prune the floor canes. So now, that first year it set out was the first year canes, the primicanes. So now as we transition into year 2, those canes are now called the floor canes. So we're going to shorten those down, and we're going to prune them to between 4 and 6 feet in height. And if we see any dead canes, any weak or damaged canes, those need to be completely taken out. They're not going to be very productive for us. And if it's a really prolific variety, and it's produced a lot of canes per square foot, we want to thin those down and pick the 3 to 4 strongest, best looking canes for that particular area. If we don't thin them out, it can get they can get too dense in there and not have good airflow. We want to keep our hedgerow to between 6 and 18 inches wide. And so if we have root suckers that have come out past that 8 to 16 inch width, then we want to take all of those out. And keep in mind that the narrower we keep a hedgerow, the more productive it's going to be. So we want to keep those suckers pulled out. Because if we don't keep on task with that, we can pretty soon have a planting that's out of control on us. And then remember, on these, after harvest, we're going to remove those old fruiting canes. And if we do it right after harvest, it's a lot easier to see than if we wait until the winter time. Because if right after harvest, those canes are starting to turn brown and look and dying off, as compared to the new primocanes that the plant is producing that are lush and green. So it's really easy to tell at that point which canes to remove. So then let's talk a little bit about pruning black and purple raspberries and blackberries. And so on these, because they're not formed, they don't tend to form as a hedgerow typically, we're going to manage them more as separate plants. If you do have a particular variety or planting that is sending out a lot of suckers, then you might want to go ahead and manage it more as a hedgerow, which would kind of be what we talked about in the previous slide. But so as we think about treating them as separate plants in the early summer, we're going to tip the primocanes. And when we do that, that forces lateral branches or the lateral buds on the side of the cane to actually break and form branches down that cane. And so on the black and purple raspberries, we're going to, when those primocanes reach anywhere from 24 to 40 inches, we're going to tip them. And when we tip, you can feel on the very tender tissue, you know, in the top 3 to 4 inches of that cane, it's really easy to snap off. And you know, the picture here is a really good, shows really well the area that is tipped off. And again, that's about, you know, 3 or 4 inches below the very top of that cane. And so, you know, depending on how high your trellis is, kind of depends on how tall you let those canes go before you tip them. So that's why there's a range between 24 and 40 inches on the black and purple raspberries. And then kind of let on the blackberries, those can get a little bit taller. So between 36 and 60 inches. And we're going to, after we tip them, then we're going to let those go through the rest of the summer and winter. And then the following spring, all of the lateral branches that have formed, we're going to shorten those up, because after we tipped and the lateral branches formed, then those laterals were growing, you know, for the rest of the summer. And we need to shorten those back up. And so for black raspberries, we can shorten those to about 7 inches. On purple raspberries, 12 inches. And then on the blackberries, anywhere between 12 and 16 inches, we can shorten those up. And then after harvest, we're going to remove any of the canes. So what about pruning on the everbearing raspberries or the primocane bearing blackberries? So again, these are the varieties that are going to be fruiting on those first year primocanes. So we can do one of two things. We can, in the dormant season, we can, which would be in the wintertime, after we've harvested in the fall, off of those primocanes, we can cut all of the canes down close to the ground, you know, whether we use a mower, a bush hog, if you just use your loppers or shears, you can cut them all down. It's not going to damage the crown, you know, leave them, don't dig down as you're cutting them off, you know, just leave a little, you know, inch or two above the crown. When we do this, that means we're not going to have the second crop, lower down the following spring on those primocanes. So when we do this, cutting all of the canes off, we're saying we're only going to let them fruit or have a crop one time a year. But this is also a lot easier maintenance, where we don't have to worry about a lot of the different pruning or pulling out dead canes and leaving the canes for the second year. We're just cutting everything off. And then we would want to maintain that row width to 12 to 18 inches throughout the growing season. But if we want to try to get a second crop off of these primocane bearing crops, then we're not going to cut everything down in the wintertime. What we'll do is remove the harvested tips. So the top half of the cane, where we had a fall harvest, we're going to cut that part off. Again, we'll thin our canes back to 3 to 4 per foot of row. And then we'll harvest that summer crop off of those canes. And then those floor canes will be completely spent, and we'll remove those. So there's 2 different ways that we can prune on those primocane bearing, and it just depends on how many crops you want to get off of those particular varieties, and how much effort you want to put into the overall pruning. And so now we'll transition to blueberries. So blueberries, unlike the other small fruit crops, really need to have acidic soil. They're not going to perform well if they're not in the right pH range. They're pretty finicky if they're trying to grow them in soils that are above 5.2. Just not going to produce very well at all. And so, you know, for soils that don't have the right pH, we're going to need to make some amendments with that. And there's going to be actually after the presentation, you'll receive an email from Chris, and she's going to send you a handout with the slides that I'm presenting on now. And there'll also be an additional handout that talks about some, in a little bit more detail, the fertility requirements for some of the small fruit crops, as well as suggested varieties. And there's also a page in there that talks about the amounts of sulfur that you would need to amend your pH. And so there's a little bit more information on an additional handout that can talk, if you're going to need to do a lot of amending to lower your pH, how you can go about that. But just know that if your pH is too high, we're typically going to use some form of sulfur to lower it, depending on how high your pH is and how much we have to lower it. We are also going to utilize peat moss in our planting holes when we do our initial planting. And we typically mix that a 50-50 peat moss to soil mix. And also when we do any type of fertilizing with blueberries, we want to make sure that we're using fertilizers that have a more acidic or a more sulfur acidic residue in them. So ammonium sulfate is used typically, and a little bit of urea. Occasionally we may use some ammonium nitrate, but most of the time our pHs are high enough that we're going to need to use ammonium sulfate most of the time. And the picture here on the bottom left is a really good example of a blueberry plant that is suffering from iron chlorosis because it's the pH is too high, and as the pH gets higher, then the iron is not as available, and so the plant is suffering from that. So this is a pretty classic simple symptom that blueberries can show us and let us know that we're going to need to amend the soil and lower its pH. As far as site preparation for blueberries, blueberries are a shallow rooted plant, and they have a fibrous root system. They don't have a tap root. And so if you look at this picture on the top left or top right, you can see the root system on, this is probably a 4-year-old blueberry plant, maybe 5-year-old blueberry plant. Very fibrous, shallow rooted. And they definitely do not tolerate poorly drained soils. They do not like to have their feet wet at all. And so we want to make sure that we're able to have well-drained soils, and a lot of times they're going to benefit from either being grown in a raised bed or form up some type of berm or hill that can help with drainage. It's something that can be 6 to 8 inches in height and at least 2 to 3 feet wide. You can see the picture on the bottom there with some bermed up ridges for a blueberry planting, kind of like the picture towards the beginning of the presentation where we see the water standing in the aisle but not up where the root system is, so it helps the drainage quite a bit. And if we also look on the picture on the top left, or I'm sorry, the top right here, we see that they've used a sawdust mulch around. For this picture, they pop that plant up out of the ground. That would not typically be what you would be seeing. All of those roots would be actually in that mulch. And so I just wanted to show you that this demonstrates how important a mulching material is for your blueberries. We typically suggest sawdust, but wood chips, leaves, pine needles, any type of mulching material that you have available is going to be better than no mulch at all. As far as selecting your plant material, you have a couple of choices when you're ordering blueberry plants. You can either order bare root or containerized plants. And the bare root plants are going to be a lot less expensive to purchase. They're a lot easier to transport. Shipping costs will be pretty low, but they're gonna need to be grown. Let's see, how do I want to word this? It's going to take longer for them to come into production than if buying a containerized plant. When you buy a containerized plant, it's already a 2-year-old plant. And so the bare root plants are just first year. And so you could be delayed in another couple of years with your bare root planting. But conversely, containerized plants are going to be more expensive to purchase. You do tend to see a little bit higher survivability and, again, the earlier yielding because they are an older plant initially when you get them and put them into the ground. So we can plant them either in late fall or early spring, either one. We're looking at spacing those anywhere between 5 and 8 feet apart. I would not go any closer than that. It's hard to imagine when you get a blueberry bush, a young plant, that it would ever end up touching if you put it at 5 feet apart. But they can definitely grow and start touching each other pretty quickly. So we don't want to cheat that spacing. And then if you have multiple rows of them, this says 10 to 12 feet between rows. Definitely don't go any closer than that. Depending on what type of equipment you might have to be mowing in your yard, you need to be able to mow between those rows. And if you plant any tighter, you won't be able to get your equipment through there without starting to run into the branches of these mature plantings. Blueberry plantings, if they're happy with their location, if the pH is right, the drainage is right, they could be there for 40, 50, 60 years. Once they find a happy location, that's, you can expect to have them for quite a while. So that's why finding that right site and doing the groundwork initially is really important. When we're planting in the planting hole or furrow, if you create that, it doesn't need to go very deep, maybe just 12 to 15 inches. It's definitely make sure you make the hole wide enough to get the whole root system in. And then once that hole is dug, we're going to mix in the soil and the peat moss 50-50 and then backfill that back in. And just remember, when you're working with peat moss, it takes it a while to absorb the water. And so, you can see this picture here. This is actually a picture of another educator, Elizabeth Wally. She's wetting up this peat moss in a muck bucket. And once she gets done putting that water in, she's probably going to take her hands and mix that together and let that sit for a little bit and let that peat moss really absorb the water. Once it does absorb the water, then it will hold it for quite a while. So it's just initially getting it to start absorbing takes a while. If you're buying containerized plants, once you pop them out of the container, you want to make sure you break up that root mass so that those roots can really start to spread out and grow. We don't want them to start getting root bound, and so we want to break them apart and let them work their way out. And then you want to make sure you're setting the plants at the same depth as they were growing in the nursery or in that pot. So don't bury them too low or too shallowly. Think about the collar of the crown being right at the soil surface. And then also on the planting on the blueberries, we can make once you get your hole dug, we can make a small little mound in the middle of it and kind of put the crown of the plant on the top of that mound and drape the roots over the side. And then we're going to be filling that back in with our 50-50 soil and peat moss mix, kind of firming that up as we go. Then we want to make a little basin around that so it will hold a little bit of water, and we're going to, you need to put quite a bit of water in at that initial planting, a couple of gallons at each plant to make sure it's watered in really well. And then mulching, make sure that we're going to mulch the surface of a new planting, soil surface. It's going to help make sure that those new young roots don't dry out. We're looking at least a couple inches thick. Honestly, you might as well go 3 or 4 inches at this point, and then make that in a band that's probably 3 or 4 feet wide, over the center of the whole row. We don't want to throw sawdust right up around the crown of the plant. That's just going to attract rodent and other issues. So we definitely want to cover it, but just don't throw it right into the center of the crown of the plant. And because those blueberry roots are so fibrous and shallow, they tend to grow in the really top layer of the soil, and a lot of times into that mulch that you're putting down. And as that mulch starts to decompose, we're going to need to add new, because we don't want that root system to be exposed. And so depending on how thick we put the mulch on, we may need to add new mulch every year, maybe every 2 to 3 years. And just wanted to show you, this is some old research data from some blueberry work that they did in Champaign up on campus back in the 80s. And if you look at this chart, it just shows the years from 1981 to 1988, when they collected data off of blueberries that were mulched and not mulched. And so if you look at the total yield difference in plants that had received a type of mulch versus no mulching, there's quite a significant difference there in the yield. So your blueberry plants definitely benefit from the impacts of the mulch. It's going to help conserve the soil moisture. It helps to increase organic matter in the soil. It also helps to moderate soil temperature. We can get pretty warm here in Southern Illinois, and so if we can help keep that temperature more moderated from our either really hot summers or potential really cold winters, that mulch helps to moderate the soil temperature. And it also gives you a benefit of weed control. We'll talk a little bit about irrigation, especially for blueberries. They're, again, with their being very shallow rooted and no taproot type setup, or structures in their root, they don't have the ability to reach deeper into the soil and gather moisture from deeper down. And so we're going to need to apply additional soil moisture or water to help with those shallow rooted plants. And so providing some uniform and adequate supply is going to be essential for their growth. Just like a lot of our vegetable crops, we talk about, an inch to 1.5 inches of water a week would be optimum for them. And again, this is where the mulch comes into play to help hold that moisture in. If you look at this picture, actually, I think this is a picture of a blueberry planting on a research farm in Washington State. And you can see the drip irrigation tube running through there. They definitely have this planting up on a raised bed or a berm, but their mulch is definitely decayed. It would be about time for them to add some new mulch. They've got just a little bit of past blueberry leaf litter on the bottom, but would need some more mulching on that as well. But you can see you can just add, drip irrigation is a really easy way to fertilize or to irrigate if you've got several plants, but also just taking your hose. If you just have, 6 or 8 plants out in the yard, or even just a couple in your container, it's really easy to just give them a drink of water once a week with the hose. And now, as far as pruning with the blueberries, at the time that we plant our planting, if there's any twiggy growth or dead or damaged canes, we want to remove that at the base of the plant. So we're just leaving the really strong new growth. And this is going to be hard for a lot of folks, but we're going to want to strip the blooms or blossoms off of the young plants for the first 2 or 3 years that you set those out, which is really hard for everybody to do because you planted blueberries because you love to eat blueberries, and it's it's really hard to pull those blossoms off and know that you're not going to have any fruit from the first couple of years. But if we can do that, that's going to allow us to have a stronger plant and a healthier plant in the long run. And then we're going to want to remove any injured or weak, diseased wood for the first couple of years. Anything that's any of the canes that are twisting, or if they're growing low or more horizontally with the ground instead of growing vertical, we want to take some of those out as well. And then, ideally a blueberry bush is going to have approximately the same number of canes that are 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, and 5 years old. So an average bush should have around 20 canes total, which means that we're going to leave about 4 canes for each year of growth. And keep in mind that our 2- and 3-year-old canes are the most productive. And so after we hit year 5, year 6 of our planting, then we could start to remove those very first canes, the oldest canes, out. And this is called, this is a way to do rejuvenating pruning. And so if we don't want to have canes that have been in that same particular plant for 7 or 8 years. They're past their prime. We need to go ahead and remove those out. And again, we're going to prune as close to the ground as we can without damaging the crown. And blueberries fruit on they're going to fruit on the ends of the cane, on the ends of those canes. And so we never want to prune a blueberry with our hedge trimmers. We don't want to go in and think, oh, I don't like the shape of how this bush is looking. I'm just going to take my hedge trimmers and make it nice and round. We don't want to do that because now we're taking off all of the fruit buds. So we're going to prune complete canes out. And if you've got, if you have a season where you produce a lot of canes in one year, you want to think about thinning those down. Because if we have more than about 4 new canes from the previous year, we're going to want to remove those out so that we've got, you just keep about four per year in there. So if we think about a 5-year-old planted bush, there should be roughly about 20 canes in there, 4 canes for each of the years that it's been producing. And again, and then we just remove out the any dead or damaged twigs, any excessive young canes that have come up, and then the oldest canes each year after year 5. So here's a kind of a before and after picture on blueberries. You can see this in the top in the before picture. There was it was a pretty woolly and a lot of canes about the same age. So we needed to thin that out. So then you can see after pruning, we've really cleaned that up and gotten a certain number of canes in there. I can see, you see the ones that are kind of that brownish red color. Those are the newer canes. And as they get older, then the wood will kind of gray up, as you can see in the older canes that are more tan or grayish color. And then we also need to think, we talked just a touch on bird predation. We see birds impacting quite a bit on blueberries. You know, they can get into your blackberries and raspberries, and maybe even strawberries sometimes too. But mainly for our blueberries, we need to figure out a way to keep the birds off of them. And so if you have a really large planting, you know, being able to put a net, some type of netting, build some type of structure to keep the birds off. If you just got a couple of plants around the house, as you're getting closer to harvest and those fruits are starting to turn ripe, you might need to throw a bed sheet or some type of cloth over them to kind of keep the birds off. Is it necessary? No, but in some research that we did here at Dixon Springs I think it was back in the late 80s, early 90s, where we collected yield data from blueberries that were not under bird netting and blueberries that had netting over them. There was almost a third of the crop lost from bird depredation that for the plants that did not have netting. So they can impact it. And so if you are really, really into your blueberries and really counting on their harvest and want to make those have get as much fruit off them as possible, you may need to think about some bird protection on those. And I think with that, I've finally come to the end, and I guess we'll be ready for questions. And my contact information is on this the end slide here. It was also on the first slide. At any time, if anybody needs to contact me with a question that you think I can help you with, please feel free to send me an email. Our offices are not open yet, so I'm not sure how quickly I can get back with you if you called me on this phone number, but sending me an email, I definitely am gonna be able to receive those and can get back with you. So I will stop talking, and I guess I will stop sharing now. Chris, is that right?
You can keep it up. That's okay.
Okay. Okay.
I have some questions for you, and we appreciate you coming and joining us today for our series here with Spring Fling. We did send out the email, and we have the email with your slides. It has attachment that is also the new one that she talked about that you'll have on the desirable soil ranges for strawberries and some cultivars. So you'll definitely want to look at that. That's all kinds of different information. But Bronwyn, I have a couple questions for you if you have some time. I know we've run over and we appreciate everyone staying on. What variety was the container blueberry? Some individuals had said Top Hat. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep. Top Hat.
Okay. Cindy had said the rotating trellis, Eckert's and Belleville. She believes they have some.
They do. Yes. And I think that actually Andy McNitt at McNitt Farms, which is just south of Murfreesboro, I think he's got a few out on a rotating trellis. But yeah, yes, Eckert's Farm, you can pick at Eckert's Farm, and they also sell pre-picked berries in their farm market. But yes, they definitely utilize that system.
It looks pretty cool. Another question from LD was, is agriculture sulfur top dress annually adequate to maintain pH? So if they top dress agriculture sulfur, is that adequate?
It depends on where your starting pH is.
Okay.
If you're already in the correct range, then it should maintain. But if you're at 6 or higher, you're probably going to need to do it. I don't think it's going to lower you. It will only maintain, it won't lower.
Okay.
Anymore.
Tim made a comment. It's interesting that blueberries don't like wet feet. At Indiana Dunes, the blueberries grow in true bogs. So I guess that's a wetter area that they've been planted in.
Well, and if we think about the bogs, that's in the peat moss, and so there's
Yeah.
being growing in that peat, it may I don't want to say that it drains differently, but it may keep the water off of their roots a little bit. So there's always exceptions to the rules, for sure.
Absolutely.
But I can tell you my experience in our Southern Illinois clay soils, they do not like the way that our clay holds the moisture. So
Another question was, do aronia bushes grow similarly to blueberries?
I've got to say, I don't have any experience with aronia berries, so I don't feel like I can speak to that with any amount of assurance at all. So, sorry.
Okay. Okay, so could you please recommend 2 to 3 blueberry varieties for Central Illinois, in-ground varieties? Do you have any recommendations?
So on the handout that you're going to get in the email, let me see if I can. Yes, I'm gonna. Okay, you guys bear with me. I have 2 monitors, and I'm gonna try to. Okay, yes. I'm going to pull up a file and look at that, and there is a list of varieties on that handout for blueberries. I'm gonna pull that up and look at them real quick, and I can talk about them when I see them in front of me. As soon as I find it. Hold on. Am I sharing that now with you guys? Oh,
yeah.
Look at that.
There you go.
How cool that is. Okay, so if we pull this one up, so for Central Illinois, so when we think about with this slide, it shows you there are early, mid, and late season varieties. And so depending on, if you want to be able to have blueberries for a longer period, then we might select varieties that are in the early, then in the late, or in the mid, and then the late season ripening time periods. Any of the varieties that are listed here will grow fine in Central Illinois. And so, we look at something like Duke is an earlier ripening variety. In Spartan, both of those do really well. Blue Jay and Blue Ray are, very common varieties that we grow, that are being grown. Also Blue Crop. You can see Blue Crop has a little bit shorter window, but those have a larger berry size. And that's another thing to keep in mind too, is how are you going to use these blueberries? Do you like to make a lot of muffins and pancakes? And if we do, a lot of times the smaller berries work better for baking. They don't have quite as much overall juice that kind of gets out into your batter and stuff. Versus if you're doing if you're just putting them on your cereal, or you're feeding them to your kids left and right, or your grandkids, and they're eating them by the handfuls, the bigger the berry, the quicker it is for you to harvest. And so a variety like Jersey tends to be a smaller variety or fruit size, and it's a little bit sweeter. Whereas Blue Crop or Blue Ray is a larger, like the size of a nickel, quarter size. And I don't want to say that they're tart. They're not tart, but they don't have that super sweetness that say a Jersey or a Jersey would have. Then you could go all the way to an Elliott, which is a really late season variety. So you could really spread your harvest time out by looking at that variety selection. There are several, when you look at some of the nurseries, there's several nurseries out of Michigan. You can, if you Google, blueberry variety nurseries, you can pull up some different nurseries that have catalogs, and you can't believe how many different varieties there are out there. But for the most part, most everything should grow fine in central Illinois that they would have at those nurseries.
Okay, a couple more, and I know we have people that may want have to get off today. As we were laughing earlier, Bronwyn is so knowledgeable about everything, so we hate to do every question, but a couple more questions was, can grass clippings be used as mulch for blueberries?
You can. So a couple things to keep in mind. We would want to make sure that your yard or the grass clippings had not been treated with any herbicides before we apply that. And then the other thing to think about is what type of plants were actually growing in that lawn. Did you have, was it straight grass or was it wheat? Were there any weeds in there? Because if we have some of those weed seeds that are incorporated with that, we could be introducing some weed issues. So we have to watch out for that. And then another common question that I get kind of along those same lines is, what about using the wood chips? A lot of us can get, when the electric company comes through and is trimming up limbs and such, they've got truckloads of those wood chips. And I know for us in where I live down in Pope County, that those guys are always looking for a place to dump a load of wood chips. And so that can work pretty well as a mulching material, but we need to keep in mind what's in that? What were they mulching up? If sometimes, a lot of these trees might have things like poison ivy or Virginia creeper growing on them, and those vines could get mulched in with that. And in our planting that we used to have here at Dixon Springs, we were constantly fighting Virginia creeper and poison ivy in that. So you have to watch out what you could potentially introduce from your mulching material.
Yeah, excellent point. And one more, which is kind of a two different people have asked. How do you recommend care for container blueberries over the winter? There's two different ones. Some had a top hat blueberry, and another was just blueberries in general for Illinois winters.
So they actually do pretty well in the wintertime. If your container is not too big and you could move it pretty easily, you may move it to a protected side of your house. Where it's got a little bit of protection from wind, especially those cold north winds. If you could move it that way. I think the main thing is make sure that it's, anytime we're growing anything in a container, we want to make sure that it's drained very well. So we wouldn't want to have, potential standing water in the bottom of that container that could possibly freeze. And I think if we've sized our container large enough to meet the root wad size that we would have from a containerized blueberry variety, I think having mulch around that within that container can help as well.
All right. Well, again, Bronwyn, we thank you so much for joining us today. I know we didn't get through every question possibly, but we do have Bronwyn's contact information. You're welcome to reach out to her. And is that okay to ask specific questions if they have a variety they want to talk about or anything?
For sure. For sure. Yep.
Okay, well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We've sent an email out with the evaluation and some upcoming programs that we have, and also the extension website to go to for YouTube videos or other information. So we appreciate your time today. Thank you again, Bronwyn.
Yep, thank you, and good luck to everybody this spring. Have fun.
All right. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. This is Gail.